She said it on a Tuesday morning while I was still holding my coffee cup. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway of what used to be my kitchen, arms crossed, and told me I had 30 days to either start paying $2,000 a month or find somewhere else to live. I looked at her, then I smiled. She didn't know what to do with that. I didn't explain the smile. I just set my cup down on the counter. The same counter I'd installed myself in 1991, with lumber I'd milled at my own yard, and said, "Let me think on that." She walked away looking satisfied, like she'd won something. I suppose she thought she had. My name is Clifford. I'm 67 years old. My wife Evelyn passed 4 years ago this November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, which means every November I spend a week pretending I'm fine, and then I'm not. We were married 31 years. She used to say I was the most stubborn man she'd ever loved, and she meant it as a compliment mostly. My son's name is Jonah. He's 34. He got his mother's eyes and, for a long time, I thought he'd gotten her heart too. I'm not sure when that changed. Maybe it didn't change. Maybe it didn't change. Maybe I just stopped seeing clearly. When Evelyn got sick, I made a decision that I thought was generous, and that turned out to be the most complicated thing I'd ever done. We owned the house outright, paid off the mortgage in 2008, right before everything went sideways with the economy, which Evelyn always said was the Lord looking out for fools and careful men. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres in Mill Haven, Pennsylvania. Nothing fancy. Solid. The kind of house that holds its value because it was built right the first time. I signed it over to Jonah and his wife Bryn 2 years before Evelyn passed. I want to be clear about why I did it. It wasn't because I was dying. It wasn't because I needed to. I had resources they didn't know about, which I'll get to. I did it because Jonah and Bryn were struggling. They had a baby on the way, and I thought that giving them the house would mean I was giving my grandchild a stable place to grow up in. I thought it was an act of love. I thought it would bring us closer. What I didn't account for was Bryn. I'd always known she was particular. That's the word Evelyn used when she was being diplomatic. Particular. She had opinions about how a kitchen should be organized, and strong feelings about the right way to load a dishwasher, and a general sense that any system that existed before she arrived was a system that needed improving. I thought that was just how some young people were. I thought she'd soften. She didn't soften. After Evelyn passed, I moved into the guest room. Jonah asked me to. He said it would be good for all of us, that I shouldn't be alone in some apartment somewhere, that family should stick together. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The truth is I was 63 years old, and I had just lost the woman who'd been the other half of my thinking for 3 decades, and I was not in a position to be skeptical about offers of kindness. So I moved into the guest room of the house I had built my life in. The first 6 months were fine. I had my routines. I'd get up early, make coffee, sit on the back porch and watch the light come up over the tree line. I'd help with the baby when I could. His name was Cooper, and he had Evelyn's chin. This stubborn little point of a chin that made me laugh every time I looked at him. I'd do small repairs around the house. I kept to myself when it was clear they wanted privacy. Then, about 8 months in, things started shifting. Little things at first. Bryn reorganized the kitchen and put the coffee maker in a cabinet, which meant I had to ask where it was every morning until I memorized the new location. She bought a subscription to some meal delivery service and started leaving notes about which food in the refrigerator was theirs. Jonah started spending more time at work, or at least that's what he said. The guest room became the subject of a conversation. Bryn thought it should be a home office. Then she thought it should be a nursery for when they had another baby. Then she said both things in the same week. I stayed quiet about it. I figured she was just thinking out loud. She wasn't thinking out loud. About 14 months after I moved in, Bryn sat me down. Jonah was present, but he was examining the pattern on the rug with great concentration and explained that I needed to contribute to the household financially. She used the word contribute, the way some people use the word invest, with a kind of careful enthusiasm that tells you the conversation has been rehearsed. She said $2,000 a month was fair, given the size of the room and the utilities I was using. Jonah didn't say anything. I didn't say anything for a moment either. I looked at my son. He was still looking at the rug. There's a certain kind of silence that a man makes when he's decided not to be present in a room he's physically sitting in, and Jonah had mastered it completely. "How much rent did you have in mind?" I asked, just to make her say the number again. $2,000. That's more than fair, Clifford. A room in this area goes for at least that. I nodded slowly. I was thinking about the deed I'd signed. I was thinking about the fact that the house had been worth $340,000 when I transferred it, and probably closer to $410,000 now, given what had happened to property values in Millhaven since the highway expansion. I was thinking about the 31 years of my life that were in the walls of that house. I was thinking about the corner of the basement where I'd built Cooper's crib from white oak. I'd milled the lumber myself, cut the joints myself, finished it with a food-safe oil so there was nothing toxic near my grandson's skin. I was thinking about all of that. And then I smiled. "Let me think on that," I said. Bryn looked like she'd expected more resistance and wasn't sure what to do with the lack of it. She nodded. Jonah finally looked up from the rug. He looked relieved, which told me everything about what he'd been afraid of. I went to bed that night, and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about Evelyn. I thought about something she used to say when I was upset about something that hadn't fully played out yet. She'd say, "Cliff, don't tip your hand before the river card." She was the only person in the world who could talk to me about poker and make it feel like wisdom. She was right, of course. She was almost always right. I had 30 days. I decided to use them carefully. Here's what Jonah didn't know about me. Here's what Bryn certainly didn't know. And I'll be honest, it's partly my fault they didn't know, because I am not a man who talks about money easily. 40 years ago, when Jonah was not yet born and Evelyn and I were young and stupid and brave, I started a small hardwood lumber operation in central Pennsylvania. Not a sawmill exactly. I contracted the milling, but I sourced timber. I built relationships with landowners. I developed a reputation for straight dealing and quality material. It was hard work. There were 3 years in the early 90s where I genuinely didn't know if we'd make it. Evelyn went back to work as a school administrator so we could keep the business afloat. We didn't take a vacation for 6 years. But we made it. And then some. By the time Jonah was in high school, Caldwell Hardwood Supply, that's what I named it, after Evelyn's grandmother, was one of the larger independent hardwood distributors in the mid-Atlantic. Custom millwork, architectural lumber, flooring stock. We had contracts with builders, with furniture makers, with a few high-end cabinetry shops in New York that I was quietly proud of. We had a yard in Millhaven, a yard in Harrisburg, and a small operation outside Frederick, Maryland. I kept the business quiet. Not secret. If you'd asked me, I would have told you, but I didn't announce it. I drove the same truck I'd driven for 12 years. I fixed my own gutters. I packed a lunch. The house I signed over to Jonah. That was not all I had. What Jonah knew about me was that I ran a lumber business. He knew it in the way you know something that's always been true, the way you know your father is a certain height or takes his coffee black. He knew it without knowing what it meant. He'd come to the yard a few times as a kid, shown mild interest, grown up and moved away and gone into something with computers, which was fine. I was proud of him. I never expected him to join the business. But he didn't know about the property. He didn't know about the 300 acres in Clearfield County that I'd been holding for 22 years, timbered selectively, leased for hunting rights, and had been approached about purchasing for a conservation easement just 2 years before, at a number that would have made his eyes water. He didn't know about the retirement account that Evelyn and I had spent 3 decades building quietly. He didn't know about the business itself, which I still owned entirely and which still generated income I lived comfortably on. I am not a rich man in the way people mean when they say rich. I don't have a yacht. I've never been to Europe. But I have worked every day of my adult life, and I have kept what I earned, and I have not needed $2,000 a month from my son's wife to survive. I started making calls. My business manager is a woman named Tess, who's been with me for 18 years and has the organizational capacity of a very focused hawk. I called her, and I told her I needed the apartment above the Millhaven yard made ready. There was an apartment up there. 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, big windows looking out over the yard and the woodsheds and the hills behind. We'd rented it out for a while, then left it empty during COVID, then just never gotten back to renting it. I'd always liked that apartment. Tess said, "Is this about Jonah?" I said, "It is." She said, "I'll have it ready in 10 days. She didn't ask more than that. Tess has never asked more than necessary, which is one of the reasons I've kept her for 18 years. I also called my attorney, a man named Prewitt, who I've worked with for 20 years and who has the manner of a funeral director and the mind of a chess player. I told him I wanted to review my estate planning documents, not change anything necessarily. Just review. He said he'd have everything ready for our meeting on Friday. Then I went about my normal week. I had coffee on the back porch. I watched the light come up. I bounced Cooper on my knee while Bryn was in the shower, and I told him things that didn't need to be said out loud, but that I needed to say. I told him his grandmother would have thought his chin was the most wonderful thing she'd ever seen. He grabbed my finger and chewed on it with his 4 new teeth, and I decided that was an agreement. Jonah tried to talk to me twice during that week. Both times he got as far as "Dad, I want you to know," and then something happened. His phone rang, Bryn called from another room, Cooper knocked something over, and the conversation didn't happen. I didn't push it. If a man can't finish a sentence he started himself, he's not ready for the conversation. On the Tuesday of the 2nd week, Bryn asked me if I'd made a decision. I said I had. I told her I thought she was right, that it was time for a change, and that I'd be moving out by the end of the month. She looked like she'd expected more of a fight. "Oh," she said. "Well, I think that's for the best, Clifford. Honestly." "I do too," I said. "Honestly." Jonah was home that evening. He came to find me in the workshop. I still had my workbench in the basement. I kept it up even though the rest of the basement was Bryn's domain now. And he sat on the old stool and watched me sand a cabinet door I was finishing for a neighbor. He sat there for a while without saying anything. "You don't have to go," he finally said. "I know," I said. "Mom wouldn't have wanted." "Jonah." I set down the sanding block. I looked at my son. He was 34 years old, and he looked about 17 right then. "Your mother would have had some very specific opinions about the last 6 months. You know that, and I know that. Let's not make her responsible for the decisions we're making as grown men." He didn't say anything for a while. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I have a place," I said. "What place? Where?" "A place I've had for a while," I said. "You've been there. When you were small." He went quiet. I could see him trying to remember. He'd been to the Millhaven yard a handful of times when he was a kid, maybe 8, 9 years old. Old enough to remember the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the way the sheds went back into the hillside, the big sliding doors on the dry kiln, but not old enough to have understood what any of it was. The morning I left, I packed what was mine. It wasn't much. I'd lived simply in that guest room. I had my tools, my books, Evelyn's photo that sat on the nightstand, a cardboard box of things I'd kept from the years before, a watch that had been my father's, A folded letter Evelyn wrote me on our 10th anniversary. A small oak box I'd made the winter I turned 40 with her initials on the lid. I carried those things out to my truck. Jonah was standing in the driveway. "I feel like I'm missing something," he said. "You probably are," I said. "I wasn't being cruel, I was just telling the truth." I drove to the yard. Tess had done exactly what she'd said she'd do, in exactly the time she'd said she'd do it. The apartment was clean, the heat was on, there was coffee in the kitchen, and firewood stacked by the back door. Through the big windows, I could see the yard spread out below. The sheds, the stacks of lumber sorted by species, the small forklift parked where it always was, the hills going gold in the late October light. White oak, red oak, cherry, walnut, ash. The smell of it came up even through the windows. I stood there for a while. I thought, this is mine. Not in a gloating way, just in the oldest, plainest sense. I had built this. I had worked for this. I had not asked anyone to carry it for me. 2 weeks later, Jonah called. He'd been talking to his cousin Wesley, apparently. Wesley was closer to my world. He'd done some work with the Frederick Yard years back, and something Wesley said had made Jonah start asking questions. He called Tess directly. I don't know exactly what she told him. Tess is loyal, but she's also honest, and when a man's son calls asking where his father lives, she's not going to lie. So Jonah knew where I was. He drove out on a Saturday morning. He stood in the yard below the apartment and called my cell phone, and I looked out the window and saw him standing there in his jacket, looking up at the sheds, and I buzzed him in. He came up the stairs slowly. He walked into the apartment and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the windows and the view. And then he looked at me and said, "Dad, how long has this been here?" "The yard? 40 years, give or take." "And Tess said there are 2 other locations, Harrisburg and Frederick." He sat down. He looked like a man doing math he wasn't sure he could finish. "I didn't know," he said. "No," I said. "Why didn't you ever?" "You never asked," I said. "And I didn't volunteer it. I didn't think you needed to know what I had. I thought you needed to know who I was." That sat between us for a while. "Bryn thinks," he started. "Jonah," I said, "what Bryn thinks about my finances is not the conversation I want to have with you today. The conversation I want to have is, what do you think? About all of it. About the last year. About your mother's house and the guest room and the rent conversation. About being the man you want to be." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think I let it happen. I think I kept waiting for someone else to do the right thing, and it never occurred to me that someone else was me." I made us coffee. We sat at the small table by the window and drank it and watched one of the yard workers moving lumber with the forklift below. Slow and careful, the way good work gets done. Jonah told me some things about his marriage that I hadn't known. I'm not going to repeat them here because they're his. But I'll say that what I heard made me understand Bryn differently. Not excuse her, but understand her. She'd been carrying things I hadn't seen, and she'd been carrying them in ways that were hard on everyone around her, and Jonah had been failing to address it for long enough that it had become the shape of their life together. "That's fixable," I said, "if you want to fix it." "I don't know if she'll." "You can't control what she'll do," I said. "You can only control what you do. That's true in business, and it's true in marriage, and it's true in everything else." He nodded. We sat there a while longer. Before he left, he walked through the apartment, and then we went downstairs, and I walked him through the main shed. The one with the cherry and walnut, the figured maple, the wide plank white oak that I'd been drying for 3 years for a custom furniture maker in Philadelphia. He ran his hand along a stack of cherry boards, and I watched his face do the thing faces do when they encounter something beautiful they didn't expect. "This is all yours," he said. "It is," I said. "I grew up not knowing." "You grew up knowing your father ran a lumber business," I said. "The rest of the details, those were mine to share when the time was right." Maybe I waited too long. Maybe you didn't ask soon enough. I think we can share that." He laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind that surprises a man when he's been sitting in something heavy. He shook his head. At the doorway of the main shed, he turned back and looked at the rows of lumber disappearing into the dim back of the building, and I could see him seeing it, really seeing it, the scale of it, the decades of it, what it had taken. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know you are," I said. We didn't hug. We're not huggers, Jonah and I. We shook hands, which in our family means the same thing. He drove away, and I stood in the yard, and the October air smelled like raw wood and cold, and something clean, the way the air smells before the first real snow of the year. Tess came out of the office and stood beside me. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Okay," I said. "Just okay." "Better than okay," I said. "Worse than I'd hoped. About what it needed to be." She nodded and went back inside. I went back up to the apartment and poured the last of the coffee and stood at the window and looked at the yard and the sheds and the hills beyond, the leaves going red and yellow and the sky, doing that grey thing it does in Pennsylvania in late fall, a soft grey, not threatening, just settling in. Evelyn would have had opinions about all of it, of course. She would have told me I should have talked to Jonah years ago. She would have told me that men who don't explain themselves shouldn't be surprised when they're not understood. She would have been right. But she also would have said, the boy came. That's what matters. He came and he saw, and now he knows. Cooper came with Jonah and Bryn 2 weeks after that, a Sunday visit. Bryn was quiet, and I was quiet, and Jonah talked a little too much to fill the space, which is what Jonah does when he's nervous, always has been. Cooper ran around the yard like he owned it, which I suppose he might someday, in some form, if things go the way I hope. He found a piece of cherry off-cut in the scrap pile, a small piece, smooth, the color of dark honey, and he carried it around with him all afternoon like it was a treasure. When they were getting ready to leave, he handed it to me solemnly, the way small children hand things to people they love. I took it. I put it in my coat pocket. I still have it on the windowsill by the kitchen sink, that piece of cherry. I see it every morning when I make my coffee. It's a small thing, but it's warm-colored and solid, and it's from my yard, and my grandson put it in my hands, and some mornings, that's enough to make the whole rest of the day feel like something worth having. I'm not sure what Bryn and Jonah will sort out between them. That's their work to do. I have my own work, the yard, the leases, the Frederick account that needs attention, a new relationship with a custom staircase maker in Pittsburgh that Tess thinks could be significant. I'm 67 years old and I am not tired. My father worked until he was 74, and when he finally retired, he said the hardest part wasn't the work. It was figuring out what to do with the quiet. I understand that now. But I'm not there yet. The sheds need weatherproofing before winter, and there's a stand of white oak in Clearfield County I want to walk before the snow comes. And in the morning, the light comes through those big windows at an angle that hits the wood grain on the floor, in a way that makes the whole apartment glow for about 15 minutes. And in those 15 minutes, with my coffee, with the yard below me and the hills beyond, I'm as close to peace as a stubborn 67-year-old man with dirty boots and a piece of cherry on his windowsill is ever likely to get. That's enough. That's more than enough. The piece of cherry wood is still on my windowsill. I see it every morning and I think about what it cost to get here. Not in money, but in the quieter currency that doesn't show up on any ledger. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. That's the part people sometimes get wrong about stories like mine. They hear it and they think, the old man had a plan. He was patient. He waited for his moment. But that's not what happened. What happened is I spent 67 years trying to do things right. The work, the marriage, the way I treated people who worked for me. And when someone finally pushed hard enough, all that rightness had somewhere to stand. That's how I've come to understand what people call karma. not a cosmic scoreboard, not punishment handed down from somewhere above. Just the plain mechanical fact that the things you build over a lifetime don't disappear when someone stops looking at them. I built the yard. I built the relationships, the accounts. I built a life that was solid before Bryn ever walked through my door. When she demanded rent from me, she was pushing on a wall she didn't know was holding up the ceiling. Jonah's failure wasn't cruelty. I want to be clear about that. My son is not a cruel man. His failure was a failure of character in the specific way that good people fail. He knew what the right thing was, and he kept waiting for it to become easier before he did it. That's not weakness exactly. That's a kind of moral laziness that most of us have practiced at one point or another. The thing where we tell ourselves we'll act when the moment is clearer, when the stakes are lower, when the cost isn't quite so high. The moment never gets clearer. The stakes don't lower. And meanwhile, you are becoming, slowly, the man who let it happen. What I keep thinking about is intelligence. Not book intelligence. Jonah has plenty of that. I mean the kind of knowing that comes from paying attention to the people around you, from asking questions, from being genuinely curious about where you came from. Jonah knew I ran a lumber business for 34 years and never once asked what that meant. Never walked the yard with me, never asked to see the books, never wanted to understand what his father had spent his life on. That's a failure of attention, and I share responsibility for it. I should have invited him into it more. But a man who doesn't know his father's life isn't equipped to defend his father's dignity either. That's the connection I keep turning over. And the third thing, the one I am most certain of, is that endurance without bitterness is the whole game. I could have fought Bryn in that house. I could have made it ugly. I had the means and, some mornings, the inclination. What I did instead was pack my things carefully and move towards something instead of away from someone. That's not noble exactly. That's just the discipline of a man who has been building things long enough to know that destruction is always faster than construction and never worth the trade. Cooper handed me that piece of cherry like it was the most important object in the world. He's 2 years old. He doesn't know what cherry is or what the yard means or what his grandfather spent 40 years doing. But he knew the wood was warm and smooth and good, and he wanted me to have it. Children know more than we think. They just haven't learned yet to talk themselves out of what they know. I hope by the time Cooper is old enough to ask me questions, I still have answers worth giving. And I hope he asks.